So, Mr. Kennett, what inspired you to enter politics in the 70s?
It was time of the Whitlam government, very high interest rates, a lot of difficulties facing small business, and as I was in small business and was an advocate for small businesses here in Melbourne, I decided no point complaining. If you want to bring about change, you've got to get involved, and therefore I stood for pre-selection in 1975 and was elected in 1976.
That was soon before Gough Whitlam got the sack as well.
Well, he got the sack in 75. I think it was 75, and I came in early March 1976.
And before you were elected Premier in 1992, what was your impression of Melbourne or Victoria as a state? What needed to be changed or improved?
Well, it had gone through a period of stagnation. There was a lot of industrial activity. The State Bank had been lost. Tricontinental had been lost. We had the awful collapse of Pyramid in Geelong. So a lot of people had lost their savings. There was little industrial growth. There was no new cranes on buildings indicating that the construction industry was well. There were a lot of strikes, and it was a pretty desolate place, and people in other states used to make jokes about Victoria along the lines of, what's the capital of Victoria? And they would say $2. So we are the butt of jokes all around the country.
And now, thank God, that's shifted back onto Tasmania, hey?
No, I don't wish it to go anywhere else. All I know is we had responsibility for Victoria, and we wanted to rebuild the public's confidence in themselves and in their state.
So, through your 2 terms, I was reading up on you, and in my opinion, one of your biggest achievements was you put a lot of money into iconic buildings. For example, the IMAX Theatre, MSAC, Crown Casino, the Melbourne Convention and Exhibition Centre, and what was then known as Colonial Stadium, but is now known as Etihad Stadium now, and also the construction of Fed Square. Was Melbourne's infrastructure as valuable to the city and its people 20 years ago as it is today?
Well, some of those things you've mentioned, like the Crown Casino precinct and like Etihad Stadium, were not paid for by the people of Victoria. They were paid by the private sector. Things like the new museum and the new convention centre, the infrastructure, the roads, the Monash freeways, the tunnels under the river, were all done with public in association with the private sector. What was important was that we got infrastructure being built by private and public sector very quickly. That showed to the community that there was light at the end of the tunnel and that we could rebuild the state. So infrastructure is always important, as it is today. I mean, since we built those roads, for instance, it's been 17, 18 years. The roads are becoming more clogged, which is why the new government is saying they're going to make more freeways and link more freeways to help us move around the city. But infrastructure is a sign. Infrastructure being built is a sign of an active state.
So my next question is, I think we probably already touched on it a little bit, but just in case. So do you consider yourself as the person that turned Melbourne from the industrial working class city into the cosmopolitan cultural hub that it is today?
No, for 2 reasons. Firstly, Jeff Kennett on his own achieved nothing. No one can deliver on their own. So I was fortunate to be part of a very good team of both politicians and bureaucrats. I happen to have the added pleasure of being the leader of that team. But without every member of the team, we couldn't have delivered. So Jeff Kennett did nothing, but the team of people of which I was part made a lot of change. Secondly, we didn't change it from an industrial city. It wasn't that. Yes, there was a lot of manufacturing, etc. But we still had wonderful sporting reputations, education reputations, cultural reputations, and science reputations, particularly in the areas of medicine. So we kept building on those, and we opened up the city to the point where it was and is now recognised as perhaps the best city in the world, with a range of sporting facilities that are within walking distance of all the hotels and the restaurants, etc. So we've developed something that's pretty special.
Well, it's certainly become like probably the most iconic city in Australia, along with Sydney, definitely.
Well, I think so. Sydney has the Harbour Bridge and the Opera House, but we have the laneways, we have the restaurants, we have the sport, we have the culture.
The Westgate Bridge.
So we offer two different things. In fact, every capital city in Australia is different from each other. That's what makes coming to Australia such an interesting exercise.
And as you mentioned, the sporting events, you were influential in bringing the Commonwealth Games to Melbourne in 2006, relocating the Grand Prix from Adelaide to Melbourne, and also you were a big part of Hawthorn's success through the first decade of the 21st century. Why is sport so important to you, and why do you think Melbourne loves a good sporting event, probably more than any other city in the world?
One, we have a history of supporting sport. Secondly, because most people now understand that sport gives them somewhere to be, somewhere to go, that are outside where we work and our families. So it's a good anecdote to the things that cause us stress and anxiety. And you're right, Melbourne people will go and watch two flies crawling up a wall if they want to.
Yeah, that's funny. I was talking to, I think it was Ross Stevenson. I interviewed him once on 3AW from the Breakfast Show, and he said you'll get 10 million people to a funeral if it's a good day in Melbourne.
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
Sorry, 10,000 people.
Yep, no, I agree with that. We're good attenders.
Now, I was also looking at a bit of your political different movements and stuff, and I'm not sure if this is correct, but it kind of seems a bit similar. In your first 3 years as Premier, you made a lot of cuts to the education system, to the transport system and other things because we were in such a big debt. Because of this, do you kind of sympathise with the Abbott government with their new budget and all their different cuts? Is there a kind of similarity between your premiership and how Tony Abbott is running the country with such a big deficit today?
I certainly feel sympathetic to what the federal government is doing. It is very tough when you're in a position of responsibility when the budget's in such an appalling condition. But there's very little similarity between what he did and what we did. Here in Victoria, when we made cuts to education, we had a reserve list of teachers of about 8,000. Now, these were people who'd been in the teaching profession, who'd taken leave of absence, some of them for 10 and 12 years, and that position gave them the opportunity to re-enter the education system at any time they liked. We said that's not good enough, and that coming back into the education system after a number of years out of it, your skills would have changed, education science would have increased, so we removed those people from that particular reserve list. We closed a number of schools where the number of pupils in attendance were so few in number that it didn't give the students the benefit that comes socially of relating to other children, or where it was difficult to find teachers. So we made changes there. In the health system, we actually changed the way the health system operated and introduced what we called a case mix base, which is where hospitals got paid based on the number of operations and the type of operations they conducted. So it's very different from what they did federally, but a lot of people opposed what we did at the time, the same way as they oppose Mr. Abbott and his team now. But, sometimes you've just got to back in what you believe in, and you've got to make sure that you deliver in the public interest. Do
you think it will turn around, the government will turn around and become more popular maybe in the next 2 or 3 years when we do start to make the deficit a little bit smaller?
Well, I think in 2 years' time, if the Senate and the Labor Party in particular and the PUP Party don't throw out the provisions of the budget, we'll be back into surplus, and that's where we need to be. We've got to stop bleeding every year. But if Labor and the PUP Party throw out everything or a lot of the provisions, then unfortunately we're going to have deficits for many years to come that will increase our debt, and therefore more of the money that we pay in taxes and charges will actually go to paying off that debt or paying the interest on the debt. For instance, today we're paying about $30 million a day in interest on the debt that currently exists. Now, that's unsustainable. It's $30 million a day that could go on to infrastructure or better things in education or health. It's just wasted.
All right, so my next question is, if you were Premier of Victoria now, hypothetically, how much different would you have to run things, or how much different do you think it would be for you and your government to run the state?
Oh, not that different, to be quite honest. I mean, Dennis was part of my cabinet. He knew how I thought. I was with him last Tuesday, so we're in touch a lot of the time. He's a good man. No, probably not very differently. The only thing that would be noticeable to the public would be the difference in personalities.
And by the time you were voted out as Premier in 1999, had you had enough of politics? I read that it was starting to put a bit of a strain on your family life, which is understandable. Did you feel like you had achieved everything you wanted to? No,
I did not, and I intended and hoped that we won that election, and I'd planned in my own mind to retire in 2001. So no, I hadn't had enough about politics, and I enjoyed it. And yes, it was tough on the family for a while, but we got that back together again. But still, the public exercised their vote, and we accepted that.
What was probably your biggest highlight of your time as Premier that you can remember?
Probably returning the levels of confidence back to Victorians in their own state. That was the greatest achievement.
And in the year 2000, you became the inaugural chairman of Beyond Blue. I just want to touch on this for a little bit. What were the initial aims of the foundation, and how did you get it up and running?
Well, we got it up and running because I'd been working towards the establishment of a National Depression Initiative for some time. We are supported financially by the federal and Victorian governments, and what we are trying to do is remove some of the stigma attached to depression and mental health generally. And I'm pleased to say, while there's still some work to be done, we've got a long way to achieving that goal.
And mental illness is becoming more and more prevalent in our society. What specific illnesses, you mentioned depression, but what other specific illnesses does the term mental illness cover?
Well, there's two sorts of mental illness. There's emotional, when you feel down, but human beings normally get over that. So when you break up with your girlfriend, or you've got a bit of a financial problem, or got a health issue, you can often be emotionally depressed. Clinical depression is a genuine illness, and that ranges from a whole lot of factors and types to the very serious, such as a serious mental illness of schizophrenia or bipolar. Beyond Blue deals with all of those. It deals with anxiety, and we're increasingly spending more time on suicide.
And most recently, we've had Mitch Clark retire from the AFL. I'm a Melbourne supporter, so I want to touch on this a little bit. Due to mental illness, in cases like his, and like Ian Thorpe and even Grant Hackett a little bit, in cases like these, is the depression present from their teenage years, or is it more likely due to is it more likely coming to the fore due to the strain of AFL or professional sport in general?
Well, it varies for everyone. Some have a latent depressive illness, some don't. Many, through their life, through expectations they put on themselves, through expectations that are put on them by others, the speed of communications, become stressed and anxious, and that becomes a depressive illness. So there's no simple formula. It varies between person to person.
All right, so I'm gonna start to talk about Hawthorn now. So do you think that becoming president of Hawthorn, which was in 2005 or 2006, do you think that was like a comeback for you to the public eye and also a comeback to a position of power?
No. I've never had any power in my life. Even as Premier, you don't have power. You have influence. And the question is whether and how you wield that influence. And, of course, I was chairman of Beyond Blue by the time I became president of Hawthorn. No, I became president of Hawthorn because I was invited to become president and because there was a job to be done, and I liked the challenge of turning organisations around. It had nothing more to do than that.
All right. Also, I have to ask this next question. A lot of people in Melbourne for charity have played in the E.J. Whitten Legends game. Do you think you would ever consider playing for the V's in that game for a special cause?
No, My knees are not strong enough to allow me to even run, let alone play a game of football.
And finally, apart from your commitments with Beyond Blue, you're a guest on 3AW once a week with Neil Mitchell. You're also a political reporter for Channel 7. You were the president of Hawthorn, as Matt mentioned, for 6 years during their recent success. And you've received a Companion of the Order of Australia. And I'm not going to give away your age, but are you starting to think about hanging it all up and retiring and just relaxing? Or is there still stuff you want to achieve?
Never. No, I've got a 3.5-year plan ahead of me, and then I'll redevelop the plan for the next 10 years. So I'm absolutely opposed to retirement and everything it represents. In my opinion, retirement equates with death, and I want to live a long time. I've got a lot to do.
So that sort of ties up my next question. It was going to be, what's next for you now? Like, what's your next...
Well, as I say, I'll keep doing all the things that I'm doing now for the next 3.5 years, and then I'll have a change of occupation, and that will keep me going for the next 10 years. What that change will be, I haven't identified yet.
Mr. Kennett, thank you very much for talking to us today. It's been a blast from the past, which is what we try and do here at Time Warp, and we hope you enjoyed it too.
Thank you very much, guys. Good to speak to you.